Okay, well, we can begin recording this, and I can sort of do a little bit of an introduction. Just a reminder for those that are here and those that will be watching this, you can get the links to every session that I'm teaching and the PowerPoints to every session that I'm teaching by signing up for this course with your name and your email on our Emmanuel Westminster website. And each week I send everything that has gone before again, so that the last email, which will be not this week but next week, will have everything on it. And you're very welcome to share this material with anybody that you'd like to share this material with. I've extended this teaching by one Sunday, so our last Sunday will be next Sunday. And the reason was to give me more time to apply the principles we've been learning in sort of a real life. So today we're going to be looking at the subject of women in ministry and leadership. And then next Sunday we're going to go to Matthew chapter 24, and I'm going to show you two views of Matthew 24. The futurist, that says most of Matthew 24 is in the future, and what we call the partial preterist, that says that a lot of Matthew 24 was talking about the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, prophesied by Jesus in AD 70. And I'll be doing that so that you can see how people use hermeneutics and come to different conclusions. But today we're going to be using our hermeneutics, which simply is the Greek word for interpretation. I've used the phrase handle the word, how to handle the word properly. And we're going to be looking at using the things that we've learned at a real topic, and that is women in ministry in the church and women in leadership. If we could have the next slide, please. This slide is the slide, as I've said every session. If you go away from these sessions and you remember the principles on this slide, then I've achieved a great deal, in my opinion, a great deal. Because this is what we're going to be doing today. This is what we do when we preach sermons. This is what we do when we interpret what the Bible is teaching. And it's called the Handle the Word Bridge, or the hermeneutical bridge, but I call it Handle the Word. And what this is it recognizes, if you remember, that there is a big chasm between the authors during their original time, who they wrote for, what their culture was like, what was going on in history when Paul wrote to a real church called the Galatians, how they lived, what Greek culture was like, what Jewish culture was like, all of those things that Paul wrote in the midst of. And today, here in 2023, in Westminster, in London. And so what we have to do is the process of a very important word. I don't give you too many words to learn. Exegesis. You see, we have to, here we are, Westminster 2024. When we look at anything in the Bible, we have to go back, say Paul's letters, in time, and think, okay, what did Paul mean at that time? Exegesis is simply the Greek word which means extract. So we need to understand, what did Paul mean when he wrote to the Galatians about things? What did he mean when he wrote to the Corinthians about things? What was his intentional meaning when he wrote these letters, knowing that he lived in a different place than us, a different culture than us, spoke a different language than us, and was at a different time from us. So we have to find out and do our work to find out what was originally meant by Paul, and then extracting or exegesing the true meaning of what Paul was saying. We then have to bring it, contextualization, or I call it application. We then, having understood what Paul meant when he wrote to the Corinthians, we've now got to come all the way back over the bridge, application, and say, okay, well, what does this mean for us today? When Paul wrote to Paul did not write to you. He did not write to me. Paul wrote to the Corinthians, but he wrote for us as well. So even in the early the years of the church, when letters were being written to different churches, those letters that were written to one church were then taken to another church to be read. And so the letter to the Corinthians would be read, copied and read to the Galatians. And the Galatians would look at that and say, well, this was written to Corinth and the things that were going on to Corinth. It was written to them, not us, but it was also written for us. So how do we apply what was written to that town to what's going on in our town? So even in the time when Paul and others were writing their letters, the letters were copied, given to other towns, and they had to do a little bit of a bridge and say, well, this was what was going on in Corinth. But what can we learn for what is going on here in Ephesus when we read the letter to them? So you can see that this type of hermeneutical or handling the word was done very much in the early days. And so today, when we're looking at the topic of women in ministry and leadership in the church, this slide that you're looking at, this is what we'll be doing. This is what we'll be doing. We're going to be going back to Paul's letter, especially to Corinthians, and also his letter to Timothy, who was in Ephesus. And we're going to say, okay, what did Paul mean when he said these things about women covering their head in church? What was the culture at the time? Was Paul speaking to a specific culture? Or was he saying that for all time, women should cover their heads in church? Or was he saying something to that culture that meant that women had to show dignity and respect, and in that culture it was by covering their heads? But when we come back to our culture, women can show dignity and respect, which was Paul's meaning, in a different manner. And the debate over whether women can be in ministry and leadership in the church is over these questions. It's over the questions of culture, difference, how much is culture when Paul speaks about women, etc., and how much is for all time. So how much is culture? Oh, it's culture. So women don't have to wear head coverings here today because it was culture. Or it wasn't culture. He said women should cover their heads in church, and that means not just then, but every generation and every culture. These are the things we're talking about. What is culture? What is transferable? And what isn't? That's what we're doing. Exegesis, and then application to today. So what you're seeing on that slide is what I'll be doing no more than this. And so the disagreements over such issues come usually about what is for all time and what is cultural, and we don't have to cover heads, but we do have to take the principle behind covering heads, do you see? So that's what we're looking at. So everything we've been looking at and teaching on how to handle the word, we're going to try and apply right now. Now, I'm going to start not with the difficult passages, because if you go to the difficult passages, you immediately set the agenda like those are the most important passages. But we're going to go, first of all, to where we clearly see examples of women in ministry and leadership in the early church. And I'd like you, if possible, if you have access to your Bible, either on your phone or I'd just like you to open where you can, just so you can see a feel of it, because I can't put all of the scriptures on my screen. It would be messy. So I'd like you, if you do have access to a Bible, to turn to Romans 16, the last chapter of Romans 16, because in that chapter you will see Paul sending greetings to different people in the leadership and ministry of Rome, and he will be highlighting them, greeting them, and commending them. And in this list, you'll see that roughly a third of the people that he is greeting by name are women, 2/3 men. But you would also see, as you look down at Romans 16, that the vast majority of people that he commends, he just doesn't say greet, but he says things like greet Mary, who worked very hard for you. So where he greets people and then says something good about what they've done, you'll find that it's usually the women that he is commending, greeting and commending. 2/3 men, 1/3 women, but he makes a special emphasis of commending women a lot more than the men. And so let's just dip in here. We can only dip into certain things, but the first one we have is Phoebe. Right there, Phoebe. And that's right at the beginning. 16 verse 1. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon. Does anybody in their version have a servant? All right. See, already we're doing hermeneutics. And when people translate the Bible, they're doing hermeneutics, they're handling the word. And so in my version, which is the NIV, the modern NIV, it says deacon. But in other versions, some versions, it doesn't say deacon, it says our sister Phoebe, a servant. And one of the reasons that some of the versions put servant rather than deacon is they don't want to give the appearance that Phoebe was in leadership. They think, well, she wouldn't be in leadership, so we don't want to give her a title deacon. They think that she's like one of the 7 deacons in Acts chapter 7. But the NIV says no. This word, diakonos, is the word for minister and servant, and we're going to use it. So straight away, in our 2 different versions, we see people doing exegesis. NIV extracts this and says, no, she's in leadership at the sense of being a deacon, whereas the other version that you mentioned says, we'll just put servant here. Even though those versions that call Phoebe a servant, not a deacon, will translate that word as deacon in other places for men. Right now, you're already dealing with that bridge, aren't you? You're saying, how do we interpret this? And deacon or diakonos can be translated deacon, which is like an official role, or servant, or most properly minister, because deacon basically means servant. Paul calls himself a servant of the Lord. He also calls himself a slave, but a servant or a deacon is not somebody who's a slave. It's somebody that will wait at tables, somebody that will go and serve in a house, but they're not a slave. So Paul calls himself a servant. In fact, Paul's favorite term for somebody involved in leadership or ministry was deacon, diakonos, servant. So again and again you will find Paul referring to men and women that are on ministry teams as deacon or servant. Even Jesus, of course, was called a deacon or a servant. The Son of Man came to serve, diaconate, not to be served. And this is important because Paul never referred to any person as pastor. No offense, Richard. I mean, you're called Pastor Richard, I'm called Pastor Bruce. But he never referred to anyone. He never said Pastor so-and-so. He never referred to the senior pastor of a church. No offense, Pastor Peter. He never referred to an assistant or an associate pastor of a church. There was no such thing as pastor this, pastor that. Pastor was one of the 5-fold ministry that all people could be involved in. So I say that to say that we use pastor all the time. Who's the pastor? Can a woman be a pastor? Who's the pastor of the church? But in the New Testament time, it was servant. Who's the deacon? Who's the servant? There were elders, of course, and overseers. Another word, elders and overseers. But Paul's most common word was servant or minister. My favorite term for myself, if I have to have an official term, so people, my favorite term was associate minister of Kensington Temple. There was a senior minister, senior servant, and an associate minister. And I still refer to myself as that to people outside the church. Well, what's your role at Emmanuel? I'm the associate minister. So so here, she's the first to be commended. And the reason that she's commended, Phoebe, a deacon of a local church, he says, I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of people, to give her any help that she may need for you, for she's been the benefactor. Again, important what translation you read, of many people, including me. And Phoebe was Paul's letter bearer. So Phoebe was sent to Rome with the letter. Paul didn't go, he sent a letter. And when people in the ancient world sent somebody to take a letter, they came not just to deliver it like the postman, the royal post, just putting it through you, but they came to deliver it and explain it. So they were briefed in the contents. They understood what Paul wrote. Paul spoke to Phoebe. Phoebe understood this. So Phoebe came to Rome and she said, here is the letter that I've been entrusted with Paul. So immediately they might say, did Paul mean that? And she could say to them, being the one that brought the letter, no, he didn't mean that. He meant the other. I was with him. He was explaining to me this letter and what he meant in that area. So right from the beginning, we see the first person that's mentioned is Phoebe. She's at least a deacon. Doesn't say she's an elder or anything, but she's a servant. She's a fellow minister with all these other fellow ministers. She is high up in the church as a benefactor. Perhaps she used her house as one of the house churches. She is trusted by Paul to carry such a letter and to be the first person to explain questions about that letter to people. And that's important for us to see. Next slide. Next slide, that's fine. Next slide, Priscilla and Aquila, verse 3. See it? Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers. That's the other phrase that he will often use. Co-workers in Christ Jesus. They risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them. So here you have a husband and wife team. And this is what you would expect to happen in those times, that husband and wives would minister together. And the interesting thing about Priscilla and Aquila is that in most of the times when he mentions them as a couple, Priscilla's name is first. Priscilla, the woman. Now, in those times, that would be very, very rare. You would notice immediately that he's referring to Priscilla and Aquila, the wife and then the husband, not the husband and then the wife. And often this was because in that culture, you see, we're doing our bridge. Often in that culture, this would be perhaps that Priscilla came from a very high-ranking family and a very wealthy family, and so a family of honor, so her name would be put forward. Or it could be that she was taking the lead in their ministry as a husband and wife team. It could be that she was taking the lead. We know she was involved in teaching, his name's gone right, Apollos. So Apollos, who was learning the things of the Lord, needed to be instructed in the Acts. He's a man, and he'd become a very powerful preacher that Paul would refer to, and leader. And it says that both Priscilla and Aquila further instructed him in the Lord. So alongside her husband, she was certainly there teaching and helping him. And you can see what a powerful team that they were. The next one I'd like you to have a look at is number 7. Verse 7, greet Andronicus, there, he's the man, Andronicus and Junia. The normal way of introducing a couple in those times, male first. Andronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews who have been in prison with me, they are outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was. So in this verse, we have evidence of a woman apostle. Some people have tried to say, oh, Junior is not really a female name. It is a female name. You can't deny that it's a female name. In some translations, you might get something a little bit different. It might say, I don't know if anybody's got one, something like, that has a reputation with the apostles. Anybody got anything like that? Of repute? What do you have? Yeah? That's the phrase. So in some translations, it says this. It says, Andreas and Junia of note among the apostles. Well, that can be looked at in different ways. But let me tell you what people are doing in their exegesis here. Some people don't like the fact or don't believe that the Bible teaches that a woman can be an apostle, because it's first apostles, then prophets. There is an order, a ranking in these giftings. And so they say that when it says of note among the apostles, or as my translation says, outstanding amongst the apostles, they say that this means that they were well known by the apostles. So you translate it, and Junia, well known amongst the apostles. You know, the apostles knew them very well. But again, that would be reading into this. Paul would not have to talk about them and make sure everybody knew that they had a good reputation, because he had gone to prison with them. So he didn't need to say of note amongst all the apostles as if to give them, credence. So the normal reading of this passage without reading into it, eisegesis, reading in, exegesis, extracting what's there, is that this was an apostolic couple. Both were apostles, and that they were outstanding amongst those that moved in apostolic ministry. Paul knows that there is the original foundational 12 apostles, of which he became one. But he also teaches in Ephesians that there will be many apostolic ministries, many evangelistic ministries, etc., that won't be like the original 12 plus him, but will be breaking through and doing the work of apostles. So here we have Junia as an apostle. We could go through more, except just for me to say again, it's the women, a lot more than the men, that he commends and says what they've done. It might be that, and we'll look at this, that in this age where extremely patriarchal societies, both in Greek and Jewish, that Paul was encouraging the women and encouraging people to realize that their ministry and their leadership here was valid and good by recommending, by saying, I just want to make a point that these women, this one, that one, are doing, this is what they've done, this is how good they are. It could be part of him affirming women's ministry in a culture that would not be that open to it at the time. We could look at Euodia and Syntyche in Philippians, who were arguing with one another, but he also mentions they contended at his side in the gospel, and they were co-workers with him. So that's just to show you a little bit about how Paul recognizes the ministry of women, outstanding women, woman that was an apostle, a woman that was a letter bringing ambassador for him, and also makes a point of commending them and explaining what they have done, even more than he did with the men. The next slide, we're just going to back up a bit, and we're going to have a look at cultural norms at the time. Remember that bridge? A different time, a different culture Paul lived and wrote in, to the culture that we live in today. And the problem is that usually the culture that you live in, your own culture that you live in, it's very hard to see the wood for the trees. because you're so used to that culture, it's difficult to step outside of your culture and say that's just culture. Because culture is usually the way that it is. It was the way that I was brought up. It's the way that we think. It's the way that we treat one another. This is the way we do it. And then someone comes from a different culture, and we often say, that's weird. Why'd you do it that way? That's a strange thing. And then there's a culture clash. But a lot of it is because we are brought up with our culture and therefore find it hard to step out of our culture and say, well, that's just cultural. To us, without thinking or examining, culture is normal. Normal. My culture is the most normal. No, my culture is the most normal. No, my culture is the most normal. That's because you've lived in it all your life. So not only do we have to have an understanding of the culture that Paul was in, and that he was challenging with the gospel, but we also have to understand the culture that we're taking over on that bridge there. We're taking our old culture there. We're going to look at scriptures through our own 2022 view and the Western culture, whatever culture most dominates your mindset, your sort of your reset button in cultural terms. And so, at this time, women were very, very second. It was extreme. You hear today people talking about patriarchal societies in the Western world still existing. Well, whatever the truth of that, that is nothing to what was happening in the first century. And I've used this sort of like this phrase by a rabbi at the time, and every Jewish man is obligated to recite 3 blessings daily. These express gratitude for one's station in life. Through the negative statements, thank God I'm not a Gentile, thank God I'm not a woman, and thank God I'm not a slave. Okay? And so there is a sort of mindset. I've sort of pulled that out as a prominent one, of course. But do you remember the Pharisee who said, thank God I'm not a sinner like those ones? It's a similar type of thing. And so although I may have picked something that was very strong, that was the view, that men were sort of very much in a different order than women. And in education, and this is very important for what we're looking at in some of the texts today, in education, Jewish boys, as soon as they could read and speak, were taught to recite and understand the Torah. That's why in the New Testament, Paul can immediately, and most of the Jewish people, no matter whether they're a fisherman or a Pharisee, most of them have a working knowledge of the Bible because they can recite most of it. Think of Jewish schools today with Orthodox young lads, again, lads, not girls, bowing in the rhythm of reciting and learning, or young Muslim boys, again, reciting and learning, and they could learn the Quran the whole Quran very early on in their lives. So there was this Bible literacy for Jewish boys, but it wasn't there for women. Now, I'm not saying they didn't pick up things as they went along, but it wasn't expected. It wasn't like make sure you train up your Jewish daughter like you train up your Jewish son. The idea was that your Jewish daughter didn't need to be trained up because once she was no longer under your fathership, she'd be married. So she'd be under the covering and of another one. So why train them? So there was this aspect. And also women, if you think of women at that time, think of Orthodox Jews. Think about Orthodox Jews and what it would be like to be a woman amongst Orthodox Jews, okay? Or think of a woman in a very strongly traditional Muslim country, very strong on Sharia. Think about those types of women and the place that they would have in those societies, and you're actually getting a lot closer to what it would be like to be a Jewish woman, a normal Jewish woman at that time. Also, I'll say this now, that Jewish girls were normally at least 12 or 15 years younger than their husbands, okay? They really were girls at many levels. And so when they talk about Mary, often scholars talk about Mary being about 14 years old. 14 years old. And those of you that know sort of ancient cultures will know that often girls were married very young. So they went from being a young girl in a family to being a young girl with a substantially older and educated husband. This was the way that things were. And it was similar in the Greek and Roman culture. The Roman father had total power and control over his family and slaves. He didn't share it. He was almost like God. He could even execute members of his own family without being taken to court, because this patriarch, this all-powerful father. Now, of course, there were prominent women in the Greek and Roman world. Some of them were educated. It says, it's estimated by scholars that about 10% of women in the Greek-Roman world were educated like a man. You think, well, that's not much. It isn't much, is it? 1 in 10. But it's a lot more than you would find amongst the Jewish society at that time. And I think about this because otherwise you might be coming back over that bridge with your sort of understanding of women's liberties today and think that the similar thing was happening right there. And that was it. And you'd be more than wrong. I saw one of the groups I love are the suffragettes. I love to read about the suffragettes, and I saw a wonderful documentary a couple of weeks ago about how women stood up for a long time for the right to vote. To think that a woman had the intelligence to use a vote, many didn't. And so if we just take ourselves back over 100 years or so, then you're going to find that the culture in Great Britain was, no, why would you give a vote to a woman? And often it would be, they're not educated, they're emotional. It would be all these types of things. Women couldn't vote, although they were taxed. And so when you see the suffragette movement, you understand that culture in our own nation was very, very different not so long ago. And what we accept today, that thank God women have the vote, because often they're the ones that keep an even keel and don't go to extremes. Thank God women have the vote. Nobody would ever think that they shouldn't have the vote. Wasn't long ago when it was and the things that they had to do, prison and all these things, simply to be treated as equal. And feminism in the good sense of the word, has done a lot to bring women into equality, and not necessarily by denigrating their femininity. And so women have only recently had relative freedom in life, in politics, in the workplace. It was only a couple of generations ago, the idea of a woman going to work unless she was in a farm was ridiculous. You stayed at home, you looked after the kids. And I don't think there's anything wrong with staying home and looking after the kids, but I don't think there's anything wrong in a woman pursuing a career either, as my wife has done. In fact, I think it's good and healthy for society. But remember where we are in our culture right now, and we're stepping back, we do have to understand what life was like. While I remember it, I'll tell you this story. It might come later with covering of heads, but I might forget it. Cultures, different cultures, this is important. So I remember going on a mission trip to Egypt, and we went down to the sea, and there was a rickety old house that was literally falling into the sea, where we did a Bible school. Now, we did it there, and they brought some Christians, men and women, Egyptians that we taught, but all around us it was Muslims, okay? And they would come down and enjoy the water, and all the women would be, clothed and everything like that as a Muslim would. And one day when I was outside, I saw the Christian girls, Egyptian girls, that had come to the Bible school, and they all came out in swimsuits and bikinis. As soon as I saw it, I was shocked, because everybody else were dressed, as Muslims would dress on a beach, totally covered in everything. And I thought, even without looking, what are they doing? And then I looked, and there was a real fuss going on, and some were coming and complaining, and I'm like, what they're saying, what on earth are these women doing? And so it was a terrible thing. However, when I went to Malta, and I went down to the swimming pool, there were lots of ladies in bikinis, so I was told. No, it was obvious there were lots of ladies in bikinis or swimsuits. I didn't really bat an eyelid. I just thought it wasn't a problem to me. It wasn't a problem to me really. That's my culture. The problem is that in the culture that we were in Egypt, it was it was so offensive. It said so many things to these ladies about the kind of women these must be. Imagine their shock, okay, that it was wrong. It was wrong. Yeah, but Bruce, you said that you'd go to a beach in Europe or something, and if women were wearing bikinis or swimsuits, you wouldn't really make a fuss about it. No, I wouldn't. Why? Culture. Do you understand? And so this is the similar type of thing that we have to think about in looking at these issues, but we have to be careful not to be overly cultural and just say everything's cultural, or go to the other side and say, no, everything is for today. We have to find the original and extract exegesis, the original intention. So let's go to the next slide and start looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And again, have this open in front of you if you can. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 on head coverings. All right. Let me read to you. Should a woman wear a head covering in church today? Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I pass them on to you. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of every woman is man. And the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he's the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as a woman came from man, so also a man is born of woman, but everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head covered? Does that not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a disgrace to him? But if a woman has long hair, it's her glory. For long hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. So here, Paul is speaking into the church of Corinthians. And one of the problems, remember, when we go over the bridge, we don't just take a verse, we say, what's going on in the whole letter? What's going on in Corinth? And one of the main problems in Corinth was disorderly services and meetings in Christian households. That's where services were in households. And they were disorderly. People were abusing the gifts. People were arrogant. People were abusing the communion service, getting drunk, eating all the food before the poor had finished their shifts, all these types of things. And so here, Paul is talking about that there is a disorderly aspect when it comes to women praying or prophesying in these services, along with the other disorderly things, and that is that they are not covering their head. And he gives different arguments for why these women should cover their heads. And the first is the order of the home, male headship in the home. The second is creation, that woman was created for man, and man. The second, the order of nature, also mentions the angels. And the third, church custom. Now, looking out here today, I can see very few women that believe that they need to cover their heads, whatever that means, in church today. Very few that do that. And yet here we are in Scripture. And so already we are making an assumption here today that whatever Paul means about why one would cover your heads and what that represents at that time, it's different for this time. Different for this time. Now, there are a few, not many, but a few churches, and most of them aren't mainstream, that still expect women to cover their heads in church. And so they would be saying, this is for all time. It's not just cultural, they would say, because he talks about the relationship between man and the home. He talks about Genesis and creation. Isn't that for all time? He even talks about the angels. Isn't that for all time? So whether you like it or not, what Paul is saying is not speaking into a culture in Corinth, but he is saying that for all time, a woman should cover her head because this is bigger than cultural. It's transcultural is the phrase. So women, if you don't have your head covered, they would say, then you are, Paul would be annoyed with you today in Emmanuel as much as he was annoyed with the Corinthian ladies in that time. So the fact that we're not asking you to wear head coverings at Emmanuel, and you may never even thought about this passage, or the fact that some of you aren't wearing head coverings, is because you have looked at this passage and you have done your handling the word bridge at some level. Or maybe you haven't even done your handling the word bridge, but there are assumptions. I've already said that even before we looked at handling the word bridge, we're doing it all the time. We're making assessments about what we're reading. Is this for now? Was that cultural? What does that mean? Well, one thing we can say as we read this passage, remember, it wasn't written to us. It wasn't written to Emmanuel 2023, but it was written for us. So how much of what we're reading is for us today, and how much is literally that we have to follow? This is what handling the word is all about. So one thing we know, that in Paul's time and in the town of Corinth, not wearing a head covering obviously caused offense amongst people. It obviously was indicating a different culture than the one that Paul wanted to promote in his church. So to Paul and to the culture that he's speaking in, for a woman not to have their head covered was to suggest that they weren't a godly woman. And it was inappropriate in the culture that Paul was speaking to in Corinth for a woman not to cover her head. We know that. That is definitely what he meant. The question is that for us today? Next slide. Well, there's different suggestions as scholars try and understand the culture of the time. And you can do that. You can go back and you can do history and you can find out, well, what was the culture at that time? And one suggestion is that an uncovered head was the traditional garb of prostitutes, that they would uncover their heads to show their beauty, or to sort of like present themselves to different clients. In that time, especially in Jewish circles, a woman's hair was very much the property of her husband. And so a little bit like in Islam today, that hair was for the husband. And so the idea of a woman uncovering her head in public and not wearing a hijab is wrong, because that hair is for a husband and not for other men to see. It's that type of cultural argument. And Pharisees believed that head covering was a necessary sign of public modesty. Corinth was also very well known as the sex holiday capital of the ancient world, because it was a trading route. It was the fastest trading route that people would use to get across to the other sea. And it had a huge mountain with a temple on it that in its heyday had thousands of prostitutes. And when they did excavations in Corinth, the type of sex objects that they found and sex idols and all types of things are embarrassing. You know, you'd be embarrassed to show kids the things they found. It was the sex capital. And so we're talking that the propriety of a woman and the way that she came across was very important in that sexualized, promiscuous, prostitute city. And so we have all of these things. Next slide. And I got a quote by Craig Keener, who many of my notes are based upon. And he says this: whatever particular nuances Paul may have wished to call to his readers' minds, he uses a word play to facilitate his point. The woman who brings dishonor on her head is bringing dishonor on her husband and therefore on the Christian family. And that is Paul's point in this context. Not her display of independence in removing the culture. Not that her display of independence in removing the culturally significant head covering would bring reproach on any husband in any culture. So in other words, in our culture here today, for a lady to wear a head covering or not to wear a head covering wouldn't say anything to anybody. If my wife came in today and her head wasn't uncovered, you wouldn't be feeling embarrassed for me, you know. If my wife came in, which she wouldn't, with a very short mini skirt and one of those midriffs and stuff, you might think, that's the pastor's wife. And you see, immediately culturally we're thinking, yeah, that would not be appropriate. I haven't got much time to go into this, but it's important that I look at this when it comes to women's ministry and leadership, as you will see. So the question is, what is its meaning for us today? And so its meaning for us today, I suggest, is not that a woman should wear a head covering or not, and there's debates over what that might be, but that a woman should dress and in appearance be modest. Be modest. Not appear as something she shouldn't appear as. Not look like she's just come out of the club at 8 o'clock in the morning. Not look like she's a loose woman. Not to give that appearance. And so the question here is that, and it could be the same about, and you could take that and say also men should dress in an appropriate manner. I got told off this morning at Edgware. Someone came up to me and said, "Oh, you're very informal today, Pastor Bruce." I said, "Yes." I said, "Because it's going to be hot today and I have to travel." So I got told off for my dress by one particular individual. I was very kind about it and everything. And sometimes I do dress quite smartly, so that's fair enough. But, you know, a discussion about what's appropriate for a pastor to wear. And we do have these discussions, don't we? We have the discussions about certain hyper-modern youth churches and people, and we say, oh, should they wear ripped T-shirts and ripped jeans and have tattoos all over themselves? And is that appropriate for we have these discussions, don't we? Of what's appropriate and what isn't, what's dignified and what's fitting for different people to wear in a context. And I think that Paul is speaking into this, and definitely what was going on in that time, whatever they were doing, was culturally out of order. But I don't think in the bridge of Handle the Word, we could say that what we're reading here really means that today we need to wear coverings. No, we need to do whatever would be appropriate in the setting, just like those Christian girls in Egypt should not have put on their swimsuits in that context. That was not the time to bring that type of liberty. And it sent all the wrong signals about the gospel and reinforced Muslim thinking against loose Christian women. It was culturally inappropriate. And you see Paul doing this with other things. All food are clean, but if eating pork's going to stumble a new Jewish believer, don't do it. You see? So even Paul recognized that there's a freedom, but he says, but be careful with your freedom and be culturally sensitive to what that means. So these were debates even in those days. And Paul was driving through this gospel that was beginning to turn Judaism, right side up and challenging all these things. And he was putting in these seeds of change that would take place. All right, next slide. Okay, this is just what I've said. Head coverings, what's the truth for us today? One should not bring reproach upon one's family or upon the Christian gospel. One should not seek to destroy symbolic gender distinctions, so you could use that, by pioneering unisex clothing. So in other words, what does it mean to dress as a man in any culture? What does it mean to dress as a woman in any culture? And what would it mean for a man to appear as a woman and a woman to appear as a man? And one should respect custom and do one's best to avoid causing someone to stumble, generally speaking. Next. Silence in the church. Silence in the church. You might want to turn to 1 Corinthians 14, verse 34, following. Have you ever studied this passage on women being silent in church? Karen, have you ever studied it? Can't hear you. Shh. Sybil, have you ever studied this section on women being silent in church? Have you ever studied it? Have you? She's just laughing. She didn't. Silence in church. Well, we're in church, aren't we? All right. Quickly, 1434. 34. Women, Karen, should remain silent in the churches. They're not allowed to speak, well done, Sybil, but must be in submission. As the law says, if they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home. For it's disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. Or did the word of God originate with you? Or are you the only people it has reached? If anyone thinks they are a prophet or otherwise gifted by the Spirit, let them acknowledge what I am writing to you as the Lord's command. But if any ignores this, they themselves will be ignored. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, be eager to prophesy and do not forbid speaking in tongues, but everything should be done in a fitting, orderly way. So in this passage, if we go back, remember what I said about handling the word, that you don't, I have to do certain things today because of time, but you don't just go to a verse and ignore all the verses around it. You zoom out a little bit to get a context, to place this verse. And if we were to go back a little bit, in 1 Corinthians 14, he's been speaking about order in the church, inappropriate use of the gifts of the Spirit, people speaking in tongues and not preaching and not interpreting, causing disturbances. And now here's a disturbance that happens to be caused by women. Now, we know even in the Corinthians that women did not have to be silent in church all the time, because we know that women may prophesy if they have their head coverings on and they may prophesy. They may pray publicly in the services. They may sing hymns. So to look at this and say, Paul is saying that his original intention was that at all times, in all places and cultures, and all circumstances, women must remain silent in church. We know already that this isn't true according to the same letter that he wrote, where a woman can prophesy in the name of the Lord, thus saith the Lord, can pray and everything. So what is he addressing here? Well, what he's addressing here is this. If women should remain silent and not be allowed to speak, in verse 34, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in church. This is the context, his own context. So what's happening? Remember, these are home churches, home churches. If you've ever had a house group or a life group, you know that in a life group, there's a lot more interaction, isn't there? There's teaching in it, but there's a lot more interaction, and there would be in these homes. And so remember what I spoke to you about, how so few women were educated in those days. Remember that? Okay. Well, what's happened here? Well, it's obvious that they are asking questions or disrupting what's going on in the church because they're asking questions about the teaching. And so Paul is saying, will you stop asking questions about the teaching? Will you stop asking these things? Why don't you ask your husband at home so that we can get on with the service and have order in the church, which is what he's talking about in 1 Corinthians 14. And the way that they used to teach in these days was often not just teaching and preaching, but there would be question and answer. Question and answer. This was a Greek way. You would question, you'd give answer, there would be the dialogue. And it was known that in Greek culture, and the Jewish were affected by Greek teaching, Paul was affected by it, that during this teaching, what would happen is the novices, the new people, the new intake that came to these classes were expected to be quiet, because they had a lot of learning to do and they weren't ready to ask questions. And that if the new novices, the new intake, began asking questions, it would hold everybody back, because they would be asking simplistic questions or questions that others had answered a long time ago, and that really they should do that in their private time and not. So it would be like me sort of like having one of these sessions and somebody coming and putting their hand up every 2 seconds to ask me questions, and then everybody beginning to look to heaven thinking, that's obvious, that's obvious, that obvious. And I would say this to someone who kept asking me questions, and sometimes I do, when someone asks me a question, I think really this is a question for the individual, but the rest of the group don't need to hear this. I'll say, come and see me at the end. Why? Because there's no point you listening to me answer their question for 5 minutes when everybody understands it, but perhaps this person, I can instruct them in private. You see what I mean? You see what I mean? When I used to do Bible schools a lot, and we have a lot more interaction, I'd also do the same. If there was someone who really didn't grasp the basics, I would say, tell you what, come and see me. We'll get a time together. I wouldn't then hold the whole church back. And so there was something that was going on that was causing there to be disruption. But the answer was that women should be silent and let the teaching go on and at the level it should be. And then the answer was to go home and ask their husbands. So Paul, as I put on the thing, was addressing relatively uneducated women. Never underestimate how uneducated most of them were. Not all, but most. And they're now, for the first time as Christians, getting opportunity to learn. It must have been very exciting for them, and they must have had loads of questions, because something that had been not ever given to them, now, they could learn. They could learn. It was an incredible breakthrough. Paul was addressing relatively uneducated women who were disrupting the service with irrelevant questions. The immediate remedy for this situation was them to stop asking such questions. That's the immediate, stop asking such questions. But the long-term solution was to educate them. So right then, they needed to go home and learn some things. But what about when they had learned these things? What about when they had caught up, if I put it that way? Then they'd have learned, they'd have grown, their husbands would have helped them who were better educated. Then this would no longer be a problem, would they? The problem was that they weren't learned and they were disrupting the church with questions. The immediate answer to this was learn at home, don't disrupt. But the long-term thing was that they would be educated. Paul didn't say don't teach them. He said educate them, do this at home. And so the idea would be that after a while, those women would hopefully come up to the level where men had been educated. And this would be a very different scenario. After all, they could prophesy, they could sing, and they could pray already publicly. It's obvious that what this is focusing on and how we would then teach this today, which would be something like anybody who doesn't understand scriptures at a very basic level should not stop everybody else by learning in a classroom setting or something, or in a house group setting, and hold everybody back. That's why in life groups, don't we, a new believer is meant to be spiritually parented. We don't all have to go through a spiritual parenting again, do we? Every time there's a new believer or a new Christian in our life group, do we all have to go through it again from scratch? No, the idea is there'll be somebody in the life group who will take them and show them the basics. They can still enjoy the life group and where we're going in the life group, but they're learning, they're catching up, but we're not all going through it again. I think that would be a similar application of what we're talking about. Okay, I say all that to get to this, and I hope I've left enough time because we have to finish at 5:02. All of this is important about women's ministry and leadership, because if a woman's to be silent in church, then how can she lead? All right? Now here we come to Timothy, and you might want to get 1 Timothy 2 out in your Bibles, and this is what we're going to look at, the only passage that actually forbids women to teach. The only passage that actually forbids women to teach. Sorry, let me just find that. 1 Timothy chapter 2. And let me read verse 11, the direct, and we'll get a bit. A woman should learn in quietness, 1 Timothy 2:11, and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived, it was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness, and propriety. Now, I can't go too much in detail, but the slides can lead you more in detail when I send them out to you. Now, the wider context of Timothy, remember what I said? You don't just hang on one verse. You go back and you say, what were these letters of Timothy about? Letters to Timothy about from Paul, and what was going on that was more general before we home in on what one passage means. Well, if you look at this slide, Timothy is having to deal in Ephesus with false teachers. And if you look at these verses, I can't do it right now, but if you could look at these verses, you will see in 1 Timothy again and again and again the danger of false teaching. The danger of false teaching. And I'll come back to that in a moment. There are a number of issues, and a number of issues amongst the women and the men, for example. And in 1 Timothy 2, he begins, well, let me go, just before the verse we read about a woman should not teach, we read in verse 9, I also want the women to dress modestly and decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God. And doesn't that fit quite well with how we looked at 1 Corinthians? But also notice he never mentioned covering, did he? He just mentioned a certain style of hair that portrayed something. He didn't mention that they were to cover their heads in Ephesus. So women are flaunting themselves of their wealth. They are disrupting services, again, with questions, usurping authority from men and husbands. Also later on, you will find the issue, a big issue, of who does the church support as a widow and who should not be supported as a widow but get married again. And in these passages, which are very important, you will find that he speaks about those younger widows that are going around gossiping from house to house, and some of them are turning to Satan and they are accepting this false teaching that is going around in Ephesus. He also speaks in 2 Timothy 2 of gullible, untaught women are being targeted by false teachers creeping into their households. I'd love to spend some time over this, but time won't allow me. So you have a context where women, untaught women, are being targeted by false teachers. Now, men would probably be being targeted too, but specifically, they're going to houses of women and they're targeting them and they are recruiting them to false doctrine. That is the background. If you look at the verses, it's one thing for me to say it's there, but if you look at those verses, you will see, my goodness, this is a massive issue that they are dealing in Ephesus, where Timothy is. Next slide. So here in 1 Timothy 2, the only passage in which the Bible forbids women to teach, it starts off talking about instructions for worship. In fact, my heading says instructions for worship in my NIV. First of all, it talks about prayers, public praying. Then it says the men are to do something. They're to stop being angry and disputing. And there was a lot of anger and disputing about genealogies. There was a real terrible false teaching going around, a lot of arguing, you see. And he says, stop disputing, stop arguing, and pray, lifting up holy hands. That doesn't mean that only men should lift up holy hands. The idea is that your hands are holy in the sense of clean hands. It's the figure of being right with God and right with others. And then we find that women are to dress modestly, without elaborate hairstyles. It doesn't mean, I don't think, that a woman can never braid her hair ever. But in the culture, I haven't got time to go into it, but in the culture, these big hairstyles, sometimes you see these old Roman paintings and models and mosaics, and you see these women, I'm telling you, talk about the beehive in the 60s, their hair is big and jewels and braided, and all of that was considered by Paul flaunting your wealth. Gucci from head to toe, all in gold, and make sure that you can see the logo, you know what I mean? And it was seen as being inappropriate and sending wrong signals, and really somebody shouldn't be known for their Gucci bag, although Gucci bags are good. But a woman should be known for a Gucci badge. She should be known because she's a faithful, strong, good woman Christian. And then we get into this passage that is the main passage that drives the idea that women shouldn't be in leadership or teaching over men. And here, again, we have this idea of women learning. And that, again, in this situation, they're not being quiet and they're not being submissive in the service, a little bit like, I guess, Corinthians. And Paul says that they should learn appropriately. Remember the question and answer in Greek culture? Novices were to keep quiet until sufficiently taught and to catch up outside class, especially with their husband. There's an emphasis in this passage of a rebellious, unruly, assertive streak in this what's going on here. Then it should be submissive and learn. Now, the next slide, where it says, I do not permit a woman to teach or assume authority over a man. Assume authority over a man or have authority over a man. Depends what your verse says. Have authority or assume authority. This is very important to understand the original word. We're going to do that bridge thing again. We're going over and we're saying, okay, it's translated in some of our versions, I do not permit a woman to have authority over a man. All right, so they are. Well, wait a second. Paul was writing in Greek. And the word that he used for authority over a man in Greek, in this instance, it's the only place this particular word for authority is used in the whole Bible. Both the Old Testament Greek version and the rest of the New Testament, this word is used once. There's other words like exousia for authority and other words, but this is used once. Why did he only use this word once and never use it again when he spoke about all in authority, etc., etc., pray for all those in authority? He didn't use this word. Well, this is what the word means that's only used once in the Bible. This word means to usurp, to rise up, to get authority. And it actually can mean one who with his own hands kills another or himself, one who acts on his own authority, autocratic, an absolute master, to govern, to exercise, to domineer, and to usurp dominion over one. So straight away, this word authority takes on a totally different meaning than if you just read it as meaning authority. It means a rebellious, usurping authority. It means a sort of like inappropriate thing. It's not just, and so in this passage you've got, they should be silent, submissive, quiet, and they should not usurp in rebellious authority over a man or a woman, over a man. And interestingly enough, where it says, I do not allow a woman to teach or assume authority over a man, I do not allow a woman to teach or usurp authority over a man, you can just as easily translate it this way. I do not allow a wife to usurp authority over a husband. And it's singular. It doesn't say, I do not allow women to usurp authority over men. It says either, and you can translate it both ways, I do not allow a woman to usurp authority over a man, not all men. Or you can translate it just as easily, I do not allow a wife to usurp authority over a husband. And if you do a word search, you will find that this word for woman can be used for wife. It just depends on the context that you want it to be. So often when the word you're reading is wife, it's woman. It's almost like saying, I don't know, in Yorkshire we might say, I might present my wife in the olden days, I might say, this is Nicola, my wife. I might say, this is my woman. Which means this is your woman. She's my wife, isn't it? She's my woman. You know, woman, wife, woman. She's my woman. It means she's my wife. Okay, that didn't cross cultural boundaries in London. So you've got this. So imagine that. Imagine if it was husband. So what you've got is this thing in Corinthians where women, apparently, are usurping authority, being a bit rebellious, being a bit shirty. Maybe they've been listening to all these false teachers that are preying on women, and they're coming in and they go, well, what about that? And what about the other? And what about the other? And the husband's sitting there a little bit embarrassed. Because really, what that woman's doing, really the husband has to take responsibility for his wife's behavior. And so that could be part of it, couldn't it? But whatever it is, it's a woman usurping. It's the only word used. So it brings something a bit different there. Next slide. Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve. This is really important, the appeal to Adam and Eve, for those that believe that a woman can't teach a man or preach to men or have authority over men in the church. Very important. Because in this passage, Paul appeals, doesn't he? He says, she should not usurp authority over a man, she must be quiet, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one who was deceived, it was the woman who was deceived. And so they say, look, this isn't just cultural, this is the big argument here for women not to be in leadership in any form over men. They say, it's not cultural, it's not just cultural, he's going to creation principles. He's going back to Genesis. And he's saying that a woman should not have authority over a man or teach a man in any sense of the word, because it's against the created order, Adam and Eve. And so Paul is not just saying, okay, in this circumstance, a woman should not have authority or teach a man, but he's saying, look, a woman shouldn't have authority to teach or have an authority over a man, because look at Adam and Eve. And so they say, this isn't just something cultural. Because he appeals to Adam and Eve, this is for all time. And if Paul was standing here today, he would say the same things. Ladies, it's not appropriate for you to have authority in the church over men or to teach men. And that's because of Adam and Eve, not culture, but Adam and Eve. So what do I say to that? You can see we're now discussing, handle the word bridge. What's cultural, what's not, what translates over and what stays. And I would say this, do you remember when we did the head covering? Remember we did the head covering? Didn't Paul also appeal to Adam and Eve then? The man was created first. So Paul appealed to Adam and Eve about head covering. He said, the man was created first, not the woman, therefore a woman should cover her head. So when people say that this passage means that for all time women can't teach or have authority in any sense over a man, then why do they allow head coverings in the church? Because both appeal to Adam and Eve. Do you understand what I'm saying? They're not just saying, they're saying Adam and Eve, this is the way with Adam and Eve, this is the way it is now. So if it's because of Adam and Eve a woman should cover her head, then should she cover it for all time? No, it's cultural. And then they say, but a woman can't teach a man. Why? Because Adam and Eve, he appeals to Adam and Eve, so it's for all time, you see? So just because he appeals to Adam and Eve does not necessarily mean that therefore what he says to those women in that particular situation is for all time. In fact, if you can see on here, he actually in 2 Corinthians 11:3 speaks to the whole of the Corinthians, male and female, and he says, I fear lest somehow as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity. He's using now Eve as an example for men and women, okay? Not just women, but here it's men. He's using Eve as an example to say, I'm concerned that just like Eve, you men and women in Corinth are in danger. So it isn't as clear cut as they would put this. Well, he appeals to Adam and Eve, therefore this is for all time. Women can't teach men, okay? Well then, so is coverings of heads. And why does he appeal to Eve when he speaks to men and women? Another example of how Paul uses example of the Old Testament for things that are taking place right there and then in real time is 1 Corinthians 10. And he speaks about the children of Israel, the rebellious children of Israel. And he talks about how they rose up and played. They were baptized in the water and the cloud. And he says, what happened to the rebellious children of Israel, in 1 Corinthians 10, is an example for you today. So the Corinthians were to go and think, oh, goodness, what can we see in the children of Israel and the rebelliousness that we can use as an example for our lives today? Do you hear? So you might think, what Bruce talking about, is this important? It is important because this is the main thrust of people saying women should not teach men. Adam and Eve, and then this word, usurp authority, is very different to having godly authority, okay? Next slide. I want to pause for a second. Next slide. Yeah, so no, this is the right side, male headship. I want to pause because some people who say that this doesn't apply today for women who don't usurp authority, they can use proper authority granted to them by the church as they're recognized, and that, they can teach in different circumstances. Some of these people who say that then go on to say, oh, by the way, and there's no headship in the family as well. There's no male headship. The husband is not the head of the woman. That's cultural as well. Well, I just wanted to say I totally disagree with the idea that there's no headship in marriage. I think it's so abundantly clear in Paul's teaching in Ephesians and right through. And even in the passages that we've done, there's been appeal to that, hasn't there? You know, you should cover your heads out of respect for the headship in marriage. And here, if it is, I do not allow a woman to usurp authority over a man, means I do not allow a wife to usurp authority over her husband by asking questions and disturbing meetings when really should be in submission and not like, you know, embarrassing her husband. Then this actually affirms headship in the family. I do believe in male headship in marriage. And what do I mean by that? Simply this: a man is ultimately responsible for everything that goes on in his family. Ultimately, that means the woman can make decisions, all sorts of stuff, but ultimately, you as a husband are responsible for everything that goes on in your family. You're responsible. You're responsible for the flourishing of your family. And so often this is not the case. It's responsibility. And here, when it speaks about what the woman, this must be my last point, being Adam was not the one that was deceived. It was the woman who's deceived. What are we to say about this? If we're to say that a woman cannot teach a man because she has an inbuilt deception in her, that women generally have an inbuilt deception in them that is far worse than any inbuilt deception in a man, and because Eve was deceived, we can't have her teaching men because she has this nature of deception that is far worse than in a man, then first of all I'd say, why to people who don't allow women to teach men because she was deceived, I would say, well, then why on earth do you set them loose on the children? If a woman is deceived, and because she's deceived and likely not to understand the scriptures because she is a woman, why would you put her in trust of the kids who need the proper teaching? Or why would you let women teach other women? The deceived teaching the deceived, you see. So I don't accept that that's what it means. I don't accept that's what it means. I think what we're talking about here is unruly wives usurping husband's authority in an unseemly public manner. And respect of marriage headship is not just a private affair. Have you ever witnessed a Christian husband dishonor his wife? They're with their wife and they treat them with disdain or dishonor, and you're embarrassed for the woman. Have you ever seen that and thought, what a horrible Christian man, domineering? And have you ever seen a woman a Christian woman dishonor her husband in public, where you feel sad or embarrassed for the husband? I have. I remember once in a high-level meeting where we were, men together, high-level meeting, somebody's wife burst through the door and started telling us all, and she was a very strong woman, but you can be a strong woman without doing this, and she was like this, and she was like, and we were all shocked, and we are this and everything like this, and I don't know why is it? It was totally inappropriate, and her husband was there. And so I sort of looked at him, went, sort of like, what are you going to do? And he just went, it's a true story. And it was embarrassing. And, I had to deal with it. I thought, don't think much of you. Don't think much of your wife, number one. How terrible. It was grating. It was horrible. It was not dignified. She could have made her points in many different ways. And he just sat there and shrugged his shoulders. So, we had to calm her down and deal with her as her husband. And I'm saying that as I nearly close, because what happens in the home influences what happens in the church. Why is it that... Why is it that women are far more active in the church than men? Why is it that men in general aren't taking responsibility in the church, and it's the women very often that are the ones that take responsibility for what's going on. And the men are sort of like, often, not always, but there's a sickness, a spiritual sickness of men not taking responsibility of their own families, of their wives, and helping them become everything they should be, and also not taking responsibility in the church. And so when we're looking at Eve being deceived, well, where was Adam when Eve was deceived? Apparently he was right next to her. He didn't teach her properly what he had been taught by God, not to take that apple, or he allowed her to do it. He didn't take responsibility. And so I think as I come to a conclusion, I've only touched on these issues, and there's some more of them are in here, that I think the importance of headship is rooted in the family. But I think within the church, women and men can minister together. Because headship, I believe, is in the family, I don't believe that you need headship to be in the leadership. It will naturally occur when headship is working at home. Men will naturally take responsibility in the church. Women can naturally rise to become apostles and prophets and teachers and pastors. They can naturally arise. And the very fact that if families are strong, men are responsible in their thing, it will filter out into the church at large. And women will not just be respectful of their own husbands, but they will have an understanding of the role of other husbands who are heads of families. And this natural family understanding will allow women and men to flourish in a church. I don't think that you need to have a man as necessarily the senior leader of a church. Because the idea is this: women can teach as long as they're under the authority of a pastor. So, as long as I'm Karen's boss, say, then Karen can teach because her teaching is my responsibility because I'm her pastor. And so even though she might have that deceit thing, I'm there to cover it. But what if I'm deceived? I know a lot of men who are deceived. In fact, I've come across more men who've got a misunderstanding of Scripture than women. So I don't need to be Karen's pastoral head because I'm a man, okay? I might be in various levels of leadership, and just by my virtue of being a man, will that prevent women under me from straying? No, because I know men who need correcting. There's a lot of pastors out there I would love to give a good theological slapping to. They're way out of line, and they're men. So I don't think that you need to translate headship in the home to say, therefore, the senior leader or associate leader or a woman can teach, but only under the headship of a male leader. I don't think that's necessary. I don't think that's what's called there. Otherwise, you're saying that a woman today is more susceptible to error than a man, and I don't believe that. It was there and then. They weren't taught. So of course they were susceptible. They weren't taught. But when they were taught, the idea is in this passage, like when they are taught, it's a different ball game. I can't leave the saved through childbirth. That doesn't mean that you get your sins forgiven, ladies, every time you have a child. It doesn't mean that. But what it means is in Ephesus, there was Artemis, the great goddess. And one of the things she was goddess of was safe childbirth. And it's almost like Paul is saying in this thing that when the fall took place, it affected pain, didn't it, in childbirth? Childbirth wasn't as safe. And Paul is saying that if you live right and holy, ladies, and are faithful and do what you're being called to do, that you will be saved through childbirth. And I think what he means by this is that the curse is beginning to be reversed. And so, ladies, stop usurping and rebelling and asking questions and learn in silence. Learn. Keep learning. That's the ultimate thing, is that you learn. And then if you learn, maybe you can then teach. His main point is those that haven't learned can't teach. I don't allow a woman to teach. Why? Because she doesn't learn. But when she's learned, can she teach? Yes, but make sure you honor the marriage headship and everything that marriage is about, and know that we are reversing the curse. You don't have to go to Artemis of the Ephesians, but as you follow God, you'll be saved through, you'll be delivered. The word would be translated delivered through childbirth. Not that every woman is, but the idea is that if you do this, things will change. All right, that's where we're going to stop. And if you have any questions, you can email me, you come and talk to me, but we have to let the guys come in now to prepare for their conference next week. Use the notes that I send out, and there's also an article that I've put in it, and I've had to just go very much sort of like touching in broad brushstrokes, but I hope there's enough there for you to run in. And in the end, if in any way you're not sure about women not being able to teach men, just remember, you're cutting out 50% of the ministry in the church by saying that a woman can't teach a man. And is there really enough evidence for that position to cut people from moving in that area? And that is at the lowest level. So, okay, thank you, everyone.